Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Guillaume, for the kind introduction and for inviting me. And I'm very happy and honored to kick off this symposium. Can I check that everybody hears me fine? Do I need to adjust my voice or?
It's great.
Okay.
It's great.
Looks okay. Okay. So today I want to talk to you about an AI architecture that we've been working on. We call it the Global Latent Workspace. And as you will see, we take inspiration from cognitive neuroscience, but this also has potential applications in AI. And so we're really part of this approach that people now call neuro AI. So the cognitive neuroscience inspiration comes from global workspace theory. You might all have heard about this. It was a theory initially proposed by Bernard Bars in the 1980s and 1990s, initially as a theory of large-scale brain organization and cognition, but it's also held today quite widely among neuroscientists as one of the major theories of consciousness. And so we might discuss this a little bit at the end also. So the theory says that the brain is going to be divided into modules for specific functions. So these would be the white and the gray branches here in the periphery. So we have regions in the brain that are specialized for processing vision, some for processing audition or language and action and so on. And these expert modules are supposed to function entirely independently from each other most of the time, but under certain conditions, the contents of one or two of these specialized modules, which are shown here in red, is going to be selected by an attention process, which is typically not represented on this illustration, but it's very much part of the global workspace idea, and we'll actually discuss this during the talk. And so these selected modules here in red are then going to be mobilized or recruited into a central representation space, the global workspace proper. And this implies that their activity is now going to be broadcast or distributed or shared among all the modules, even the modules that were not currently selected, they will all receive this information. And this idea of broadcast is a very important part of global workspace theory because it's the broadcast information, according to the theory, at each moment in time, which is supposed to constitute our unified experience or our conscious awareness. And so we started thinking about this general idea in the context of AI. And that was almost 10 years ago now. And at the time, what we realized is that mostly AI had access to maybe the branches of this graph, the modules. So we had very good system at the time for computer vision, object recognition, for speech recognition, even for language processing. Now we have very good language models. But what was missing was probably the most important, which is the integration and broadcast here in the middle. And so that's what we wanted to achieve with this modeling work. And so the idea that I'm going to present today was actually developed initially in collaboration with Ryota Kenai, a colleague from Japan. I think he's also going to speak in this symposium. And so what we wanted to do is to try and connect many existing pre-trained neural networks to a central representation, a global workspace, so that they can start exchanging information and communicating. And for us, the idea was based on what we call unsupervised neural translation between the high-level latent space of each of these the different networks. So I should say a few words about this idea of unsupervised neural translation. Why do we need unsupervised neural translation? First, we need translation because in our idea, we want to start from modules, existing networks that have been pre-trained independently from each other. And so if they've been trained independently, that means they basically don't speak the same language. We cannot hope to take a latent representation from a vision model and plug it into a language model and expect that the language system would understand it. We first need to translate that information. Now, why does it have to be unsupervised? Actually, it doesn't really have to be unsupervised. We could rely on supervision if we have a very large data set, for example, with a lot of images and the corresponding caption, the corresponding text description, and we could train this translation in a supervised way. But we know that deep learning tends to depend a bit too much on supervision, so we would like to do it with less supervision if possible, but also for practical reasons. In some cases, for some of the pairs of modules that we might want to connect to our global workspace, we may not have a good training data set to do this training in a supervised way. So for example, we may not have a good data set of all the English speech sounds corresponding to motor actions. And yet there might be systematic associations, systematic analogies between the two domains that we would like to learn. But in that case, we have to do it with less supervision. And I'll show you in a couple of slides a method that we can use to do this training without supervision. Anyways, what we're hoping to achieve then with all these red arrows is that these arrows can represent something like an analogy between the different domains. And then we'll be able to interpret some of these analogies, for example, as semantic grounding. That would be when the image of the tiger is going to connect to all of the associated linguistic and semantic properties. As soon as you see the tiger, you know that it's a feline, you know it has stripes, you know it's dangerous, and all of this pops in your head without having to think about it. Another one of these connections could be interpreted as what we call affordance. That would be when the image of the tiger is going to evoke a motor plan, maybe if you're adventurous, maybe for petting the tiger, or more likely a motor plan for escaping if you're smart. But there are motor plans that are compatible and some that are not compatible with the image of the tiger. So for example, you would not think of typing on the tiger as if it was a keyboard because it's just not the right affordance. So generally speaking, we would argue that this global workspace with all these analogies, that could be a way to create meaning in the system, in the entire system, which would be lacking in the isolated subsystems. So that's the general idea behind this approach. And before I show you the actual work and some initial results, I want to try and give you the full vision of what we're trying to achieve with these systems. So what I'm going to show on the slide is unfortunately not an actual working system, but really more an illustration of how we might expect a global workspace to behave if we manage to implement it in the right way. So in this illustration, we're going to have our global workspace in blue here in the center. And let's say we have 4 modules that can be potentially connected to it. We can have a task module. Let's say here the task was defined in advance as walk in the jungle. Then we have a language module, we have a movement and a vision module. And maybe based on the task, we can think that the system has decided that vision might be relevant. You want to keep your eyes open as you're walking in the jungle. So vision would get connected to the workspace, and that's going to be represented in this illustration by these solid lines. So we use the solid lines for the modules that are connected to the workspace and the dashed lines for modules that are currently disconnected. So that's how we're going to set the initial stage. And now the task begins. So on the next step, imagine you're walking in the jungle and suddenly a tiger appears in front of you. And because the vision module was connected, then immediately this information is going to flood the global workspace, and it will get translated into a representation that is suitable for all of the other modules. Even the modules that were not currently connected to the global workspace will receive this information in the right format. And that's the idea of broadcast happening right there. So this translation between vision and language that reflects the concept of semantic grounding that I was just describing, or this one between vision and action reflects the idea of affordance. So now, based on the information at this stage, you remember that we have an attention system that is connected to our workspace, even though it's not represented on the slide. So maybe the attention system would decide, probably wisely, to connect the movement module to the global workspace. And so on the next step, we're going to produce an escape response. And maybe in this case, we're not going to produce any language output because we don't have anything to say. We just want to run away from the tiger. But now what's interesting is that we can imagine at this step a slightly different scenario in which the task could have been different. Maybe instead of walking in the jungle, you were just visiting a zoo. And now, in that situation, for the exact same tiger visual input, the ultimate decision of the system might be different. It might be to connect the language module instead of the movement one. And now we're going to say, oh, look at the pretty tiger. And we don't escape because we know that we're safe. So the reason I'm insisting on this illustration is that here we see really 2 main functions of the global workspace, so 2 main functional properties that I want to focus on and ideally demonstrate during the presentation today. In the first 2 steps, what we see is basically how, because of the idea of broadcast, we could use a global workspace to improve multimodal representation learning, and hopefully this will have emergent properties for downstream tasks, and that's what I will show you in the first part of the presentation. But in the last two steps, we're actually seeing something else. In the last two steps, we're seeing how a global workspace could also be used to coordinate information from different neural networks in a flexible way so that we can control the inputs and outputs of other neural networks. And so ultimately, this could be a much more complete model of cognition. It's something that some people have coined system to cognition. And that's what I want to discuss in the second part of the presentation. So first, how can we use global workspace to improve multimodal representation learning? What I want to warn you about is that now I'm moving to the actual results, and compared with the long-term vision that I just described in the previous slide, you see that these results are much simpler because we're really just at the level of proof of concept right now, but this is just the start, and these results are quite promising, I would say. So the first thing we're going to explore is the multimodal integration between two modalities, between vision and language, and we hope here to find some evidence for the concept of grounding. So even for a proof of concept like this, we could be potentially more or less ambitious. So on an axis between very modest at the bottom and very ambitious at the top, if we were, let's say, OpenAI, we probably would start very ambitious. We would try to construct a foundation model that can translate between all possible images and all possible texts. We just don't have the resources to do something like this. So in practice, we started much more modest on this axis. What Benjamin de Villers did, he was a PhD student in the lab, he created a data set of simple geometric shapes and the corresponding English description. And so, for example, this one would be a bright red diamond pointing to the bottom right. And then we just want to see whether we can teach a global workspace architecture to translate, to exchange signals between a vision module and a language module. You will see, by the way, that sometimes I talk about language, by which I mean natural language or English language, typically. And sometimes I talk about what I call a proto-language, which to me is just, it's another symbolic description of the objects, but using numbers instead of words. So we can use a vector of numbers that describe the shape, the color, the position of the object. And when I talk about this, I would call it a proto-language, but it's just a matter of terminology. So we're trying to train a global workspace to translate, let's say, between images and this language or this proto-language. In more recent work, we've actually extended this, or Leopold Métier, who's another PhD student, has extended this work to, let's say, more complex, more realistic robotic environments with the corresponding English descriptions. And so I'll show you this also in the next slides. We actually have some work on scaling up to natural images, but unfortunately, this is not final, and I will not discuss it today. Okay, so this simple shapes data set, this was really meant as a toy world to test our ideas. So in this toy world, we have three types of objects. You can have either triangles, as you can see here. You can have these sort of diamond shapes, or you can have the more round shapes here, like eggs. And each of these objects can have four different types of attributes. They have a color, they have a position, they have a size, and they can have an orientation where they're pointing to. And we can describe these objects in three distinct modalities. We can look at them as images, so that's what you're doing here. But we can also describe them with what I call this proto-language, which is these basically these numerical vectors describing all of these properties, color, position, size, etc. Or we can use plain English, natural language, to describe these shapes. For example, the second one here would be a big, bright green bullet pointing to the top right. Okay, and so what we're trying to do in this work is see whether we could use a global workspace architecture to translate between vision and language. And we're going to do both types of translation, between vision and the true English language, or between vision and this numerical proto-language. So first, let me describe the architecture that we used on this simplified illustration. So we're starting always with pre-trained modules for the different modalities. So one module for vision here and one module for language. On the visual side, we use a pre-trained VAE, a variational autoencoder. So this is a network that we train to extract for each image in the dataset. It extracts a latent vector representing all the attributes, all the features of this particular image. And so importantly, this module will be pre-trained and then it will be entirely frozen while we train the global workspace. So we're not touching this module at all. And on the language side, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to start with a pre-trained transformer. In our case, we used a network called BERT that was trained to extract a latent vector representing all the features, all the attributes of each of the captions in our data set. And again, this is entirely frozen while we train the global workspace itself. So the global workspace is basically a central representation. And what we're trying to do in this work is to teach these two types of modules to exchange information through the global workspace. And so for this, what we need in practice is an encoder network and a decoder network for each of the modalities. So we need these networks for vision and we need them for language. We need the encoders quite trivially so that we can go from the initial domain to the global workspace. And then we need the decoders not only to go to the other side so that we can perform a full translation, but we also want to use the decoders to come back from the global workspace to go back to the initial module, because that's how we're going to implement or realize the idea of broadcast. For us, broadcast is basically the ability to go from the central global workspace representation to any of the modules that are potentially connected to it. Okay, so now when I talk about training the global workspace, I'm basically training these encoders and decoder networks for a specific task. And by the way, these are standard multi-layer perceptrons, so 3-layer or 5-layer perceptrons in some of our experiments, but so very standard neural networks. And we're training them for different objectives. Maybe the standard way to train a system like this would be to do it in a purely supervised way for a translation objective. So if we have many pairs where we have the image on one side and the corresponding text on the other side, what we can do is start from the image, send the image to the global workspace, and then using the decoder all the way to the other side. And here we can compare against the ground truth, and we can optimize this. And we can do, of course, the other direction. We can start from the text. We can go all the way to the image and optimize this translation. Now, it's important to realize that if that's the only thing that we're optimizing, just translating from left to right, and independently we're optimizing the translation from right to left, it actually doesn't enforce a common representation in the middle. So we don't really have a global workspace in this case, because you could very well learn different representations for going left to right and right to left. So what we need, if we really want to have a central representation, a common representation in the center, is something more. And for us, that is going to come as an unsupervised training objective. And so for unsupervised training, we're going to rely on an idea called cycle consistency. This is a very cool and elegant idea, which we did not invent. It comes from a language translation. We just adapted it to our purposes here. And so the idea is quite simple, but elegant. If you imagine that you have a lot of images, but you don't necessarily know what is the corresponding translation for these images on the language side, you can still leverage that information to train or to constrain your encoders and decoders, because if you send your image information to the global workspace and you come back in the other direction, you know that you should land more or less where you started. And so you can optimize this cycle for consistency or for identity. You can even go one step further. Starting from the image, you can go all the way to the language side. Here, you don't know if you're correct or not if you don't have the ground truth translation, but it doesn't matter. You can always come back in the other direction. And again, you should land more or less where you started. And this is something that you can optimize. And of course, the same thing starting from language. If you only have text without the corresponding images, you can use these small cycles or these longer cycles to constrain your encoders and your decoders. But importantly, this form of training only needs unpaired data. And I would argue it's a lot more like the brain, because to us, these cycles are the way that we implement the idea of broadcast in the global workspace. Again, the idea of broadcast is that once you're in the central representation, you have to be able to go back to all of the initial modules. And so that's what these cycles are basically enforcing. So let's see how the system is working. So on each of these curves, each of the points that you're going to see always corresponds to a different model trained until convergence. And we're just measuring the performance of these models after training. And so we're going to be comparing on each plot 2 versions of the same architecture. In blue, we're looking at a version that doesn't have a global workspace because it's trained really in a standard way with full supervision. So it doesn't really have broadcast, as I've explained before. And the other model in red, which has a global workspace because it uses unsupervised learning to broadcast information from the workspace back to the input domains. And as you will see, this really helps the translation. So we have 2 types of translation. We can translate from vision to this proto-language, this numerical language, or we can translate between images and the natural language, the plain English. And also, in addition to these 2 simple shape experiment, I'm also showing results from another robotic environment, which I've not described yet, but it's just to show that these findings are very general. We always find more or less the same thing every time we test these systems. So for each plot, what I'm showing is the translation error on the y-axis, so lower is better, as a function on the x-axis, as a function of the amount of supervision, basically the number of paired samples that we make available to the system during training. And so what you can see is that eventually when you have enough samples, it's about 100,000 samples in this case, even the standard system, even the blue system is going to manage to translate very well. But what you can hopefully see also is that with a global workspace in red, you can get more or less the same accuracy with about 20 times less supervision in this case, 5 times in this case and 4 times in that case. And generally speaking, it's always between 5 and 7 times better, the improvement in terms of data efficiency. So you see here that we can build multimodal representations more efficiently with this idea of a broadcast, but then we can also use these representations after the fact for downstream tasks in a more efficient way. And that's what I'm going to show now with reinforcement learning. So here, we're in a different robotic environment, but it's really the same idea as before. We can train a global workspace here to learn these analogies between visual inputs, here viewed from the point of view of the robot in the environment, and this sort of proto-language description of the robot and its environment. So we have numbers describing the position of the robot, the position of objects in the scene, and so on. And so we can train a global workspace exactly like I've explained before, and we can compare this to another system that we're going to use as a baseline, a system called CLIP, which only learns to align the 2 domains in a supervised way, but it doesn't have the ability to go back in the other direction, so it's not able to do the broadcast of information. And so once we have these 2 multimodal systems, we can train a reinforcement learning agent on top of them to perform a very simple task in this robotic environment. Basically, the robot has to find a table, and on each episode, the table will be at a different location in the environment. And then once the robot moves to the table, it gets the reward. So I'm going to show you actually movies here on the top, where you will see here the situation in which the systems were initially trained. So here, they were trained to solve the task based on the numerical inputs that you can see here in the black box. And so as we run through some episodes, you'll see each time the table is going to be at a different location, the robot will find it, move to it, and it will get the reward. The screen is going to turn green. And you see that both systems have learned to do the task pretty well. They both eventually get the reward, whether we use the global workspace or CLIP. But now at the bottom, I'm going to show you a different situation in which we're going to take these systems out of their comfort zone. We're going to test them on the other modality that they were not trained on. So suddenly we're showing them a camera image from the point of view of the robot for the first time, and we're asking them to apply exactly the same strategy as before. And what you see here is that the global workspace agent is getting the reward just as well as before, right off the bat. So it's called zero-shot cross-modal transfer. but the clip agent is really struggling. It can't perform the task anymore. So there's really something special about the global workspace multimodal architecture with the broadcast property that appears to be really important, because that's really the only thing that's missing in this clip system. So that was to demonstrate the property of vision language grounding through the global workspace. I want to talk about another type of grounding with another pair of modalities, now between vision and action. And here grounding, as I've described it before, is also called affordance, but it's really the same underlying idea. So here what we did, or actually what Nicolas Cosque did, he was a postdoc in the lab for some time. He selected an environment which was suitable for our purposes. So he found this almost video game-like environment called the obstacle tower, in which you have an agent that has to navigate. In each room, it can find a doorway, and when it goes through the doorway, it gets bumped up to the next level, and then it has to navigate again and go through as many levels as possible in this sort of obstacle tower. And so what Nicolas did is he started from a pre-trained reinforcement learning agent that we took from another system, and we used this as a teacher for our global workspace. So using this pre-trained agent, we went around the environment, we collected lots of images and the corresponding actions for these images. And then once we had this data set, we basically trained a global workspace, exactly as I've explained before, to learn the associations between a vision module, just like before, with a VAE that extracts a feature vector for each image, and this time a motor module that represents actions as a four-dimensional vector in this environment. So this four-dimensional vector is basically because the agent has four possible actions that it can choose from. It can either go forward, backward, it can slide left or right, it can rotate left or right, or it can jump up or down. And so this is represented in this motor module. And so we train a global workspace to learn the association, the mapping between these two modules, exactly like before. And after training, what we observed is that the system was indeed able to translate between vision and action. So from a particular image, the system would predict, going through the global workspace and into the action module, the system would predict what is the right action. So that's not really surprising. But what we're very happy to see also, and quite surprised, honestly, is that the system could also back translate. So once the system has predicted a particular action vector, which is just a four-dimensional vector, we could go back from this predicted vector, re-inject it into the global workspace, and reconstruct an image. And that's actually the image you're seeing here on the bottom right. This image entirely reconstructed from the predicted action vector. And you see how much information was actually encoded into this, this simple action vector. Basically, we could retrieve not just the position of the agent and the orientation of the agent, but sometimes actual properties, visual properties of the environment. So the system has really learned the mapping between vision and action. And this is also something we can verify by exploring the learned representations in the latent space. And so this is what Nicolas did. He did basically a dimensionality reduction analysis called TSNE. And he did this separately for the global workspace here. So taking this global workspace representation and applying this dimensionality reduction, or the visual latent representation here on the left. So to do this, he's basically taking thousands of images. He's sending these images into the VAE, into the vision module, collecting the feature vectors corresponding to these images and mapping them onto 2 dimensions with the TSNE analysis, and then just coloring the images as a function of whether the image should normally be associated with a left action in blue or with a right action in pink. And what you see is that in the visual space, there is no real difference between these 2 distributions. They tend to map a bit all over the place because the visual space is taking care of representing visual features, not action features. But as soon as you move one step further, you take this representation into the global workspace and you perform the same analysis. Now you see that these 2 types of images are very well separated into this latent space. They map to different portions of the latent space, which means that the global workspace has learned to organize its representation according not just to vision, but also to action. In other words, it has learned the sensory motor affordances in this environment. Okay, so to summarize what we've seen so far, we have global workspace systems that apparently not only learn the analogies between the domains, but they can also have very useful representations that we can leverage for downstream tasks, which can be very helpful for AI. And that was really the first point I wanted to make here. But now you remember the second point, and I want to turn to this now. The second point is that a global workspace should also allow us to implement something like flexible cognition, something like system to AI. And so that's what I want to discuss in the next few slides. So for this, what we need is an attention system that will learn to select the right modules for the global workspace at each moment in time. So you remember when I presented this initial idea of Bernard bars, I told you that this selection is very important, and I mentioned that there's normally a dedicated attention system for the selection. And so the question now is, how could we incorporate such an attention system in our global workspace? And this is how we propose to do it, all these green parts in this figure. And so our ideas, in fact, is just based on the idea of key queries, which is at the heart of modern transformer models, but really that we adapted to our purposes. So what we imagine is that at each moment in time, we're going to use the internal state of the global workspace to create a query vector with just a simple projection matrix. We're going to turn this internal state into a query vector that's going to describe what might be currently relevant from the point of view of the system. And simultaneously, each of our modules, whether or not they're connected to the workspace, that makes no difference. Each of the module is going to produce a key vector that represents what might be currently relevant or what might be perceived from the point of view of this module. So we have a key for the movement module, one for the vision, one for the language module, and so on. And so then we're going to compare the keys with the query using a simple dot product, followed by a softmax operation. And after this, we'll end up with a particular score telling us whether each of the modules should be selected or not on the next time step. And so with this selection, we're going to be able to decide whether a given module enters the workspace or not. But of course, if a new module is selected inside the workspace, that means that it's going to change the internal state inside the workspace. And this is also going to change the query on the next time step. And so possibly the new query will result in a different match with the different keys, and therefore possibly recruit a different module and so on. So with a system like this, theoretically at least, you can potentially deploy attention to different modules at different times and therefore perform quite complex long-term sequential tasks. So in practice, what we need is to train this attention system for a specific objective. And so we started with quite simple objectives, and I'm going to show you two examples. The first one is that we try to see whether we could learn to select the best out of two, let's say, perception modules in order to achieve noise robustness. So in this example, we're just going back to our simple shapes dataset. And in addition to this global workspace that I've shown before, we now also introduce a task, a shape classifier, a classifier that is simply trained to distinguish the three classes of objects. So is it a triangle, a diamond, or an egg shape? So it's a really trivial task. And of course, the network is doing this 100% correct. But now to make life a little more interesting, what we did is we started to randomly add noise to one of the two modalities. So on some trials, we added noise, Gaussian corruption, to the vision module. So it was difficult to recognize. Eventually, it became difficult to recognize the image from the vision modules. On other trials, we were adding the noise through the language or the proto-language module, simply by corrupting this numerical vector. And so what we're hoping is that we're going to train the attention system end-to-end for this classification task under noise, and hopefully the network, the system will learn to produce the right keys and queries so that it would always select the module that doesn't have the noise. So we trained the attention system, and after training, this is what we observed. So what I'm showing now on the x-axis is the different levels of corruption that we added either to the attributes, so to this proto-language or numerical language on the left side in pink, or the amount of noise that we added to the image side in green on the right. And you see on the y-axis, you see for each corruption level, what is the attention score that was assigned by the trained attention system. In green, that's attention to the visual module, and in red, that's attention to the language module. And so when you look at this plot, you understand that attention has learned to select basically the vision module when language is corrupted, and the language module when vision is corrupted, and therefore the attention system is basically classifying near perfectly in all conditions. I'm not even showing the data because the system was really at 100% correct in all of these conditions, because it learned to ignore the noise and focus on the side that provided the most reliable information. So that's one example. But in our view, attention will not only select input modules, maybe the most informative input module, but we should also be able to use attention to deploy different modules that can perform different operations on the inputs. And by combining those sequentially, maybe we can perform different functions. And that's what Hugo Chateau-Laurent, who was a postdoc, decided to test by teaching our global space an addition task in which we just learned to add two numbers, two digits. So for this task, we had to adapt our architecture quite a lot. So in addition to our vision module, which basically reads an MNIST digit inside the global space, we also have another operation module that we designed by hand, a module that learned to increment, that is basically taking whatever value is currently inside the global space and adding 1 to that particular value. So just a simple +1 increment. And finally, we also had an output module that learns to spit out the answer when we're ready to give the answer. Our attention system was also slightly different in this task. We need to use an RNN, a recurrent neural network, because we need to plan over multiple time steps and we need to keep track of the previous history. And in addition, on every trial, our attention system is also going to receive an instruction queue telling it what is the task to perform. So in this example, we have to add the digit 4, but on different trials, it could be a different digit. You can add 7, 8, or whatever you want. And now we train this attention system, so all the green bits, we train them end-to-end for the addition task. And we're very happy to see that it learned the right strategy. And I'm going to show you here how the system works by showing on top the decision of the attention system. So that's the green part here. So here, there's 3 possible decisions. Which module do you select? It can be the input module, the increment module, or the output module. And at the bottom, I'm showing the content of the global workspace. So which digit is currently active inside the global workspace at each time step. And we're running these simulations for 20 different time steps. And I'm going to actually show you 2 examples here. In both cases, we're always going to start from the digit 0 by convenience. Of course, we could use other digits. But you see that the task is different in these 2 examples. In one case, we need to add 2 to the digit 0, and in the other case, we need to add 8. So let's look at what happens at the very first time step. In both cases, the attention module is going to learn to select the input module, and so we're going to read the digit 0 inside the global workspace. Now, on the next time step, attention will move and select the increment module. So the 0 inside the global workspace is going to become a 1. And we're going to do this twice in a row. So the digit is now become a 2. Before we're going to select the output module, and we're going to spit out the correct answer, which is 2 in this case. But now on the right, you see that the system didn't stop incrementing after 2 times, but it kept incrementing, so selecting the increment module 8 times in a row until it reached the number 8, and that's when it would select the output module to give the correct answer, which in this case is 8. So in other words, we see that attention has learned to deploy the modules in the right sequence in a task-dependent way. And what we were also very happy to observe, which we didn't necessarily expect, is that the learned strategy could actually generalize to new tasks. So I'm not showing it here, but in some of our experiments, we only trained the attention system to perform the additions all the way up to 7, so only 1 up to 7, but we never showed the instruction of adding 8. And then the first time we tried to add 8, the system understood, it could generalize, that it just needed to recruit the increment module one more time before spitting out the answer, and it provided the correct answer. So in other words, even though I didn't show the results in detail, sorry about this, but this is just in the interest of time, we do have some preliminary evidence that our global workspace can also flexibly adapt its behavior to the situation. So something like system to AI, but of course, very preliminary at this stage. And so these are the two main functional properties that we wanted to demonstrate for our global workspace, multimodal representation learning and flexible cognition. Now, for the last 5 minutes or so, I want to turn to a third function that is often assigned to the global workspace, at least in the neuroscience literature, and that is consciousness. So possibly, some people believe that an architecture like this should give rise to the emergence of phenomenal consciousness inside the system. So can our global workspace implementation be conscious, or more generally, can an AI system be conscious? And I want to discuss this honestly without giving you a yes or no answer, because I don't think it's possible at this stage to give a yes/no answer to this question. For one thing, because it's a very complex decision on which we don't have all the parameters figured out. The problem is that there are many different, almost metaphysical stances on consciousness. Nobody knows exactly what it is. And some of these stances are, of course, more or less compatible with artificial consciousness. So the particular stance that I'm interested in discussing today is called computational functionalism. This is the one that most, but not all neuroscientists would tend to favor. By definition, the idea of computational functionalism is the idea that implementing a certain computation or a certain set of computations is going to be both necessary and sufficient for the emergence of phenomenal consciousness. Even within this branch of computational functionalism, there are some people who believe that this computation, whatever it is, this ideal computation is only going to give rise to consciousness in humans or in biological brains. And these people believe that you can never replicate it in an artificial system. So that's what I call the narrow view on computational functionalism. But there are other people who take computational functionalism more broadly. I tend to agree with this view. And so these people believe that, yes, if we isolate the right computation, then logically some form of phenomenal consciousness should emerge in these systems. But that's not the end of the story, because even if you conclude that theoretically it's possible, whether or not the systems that we currently have in AI, or my global latent workspace, for example, whether these systems are likely to be conscious or not, well, that certainly depends on what is the right computation from the point of view of functionalism. And nobody knows what is the right computation. We have numerous candidates for this computation. We have many theories, basically, of consciousness that are compatible with computational functionalism. There is global workspace, but there are other theories like higher order thought theory or attention schema theory, and probably many others. So certainly, if we assume a very specific stance today, with starting from broad computational functionalism with global workspace as our favorite theory, then yes, probably today's results do speak in favor of AI consciousness, but that's not the only option. And I have nothing to say about any of the other scenarios. Now, even if we take this particular scenario, I want to make it clear, I don't believe right now that the global workspace model that I presented in the previous slides is conscious, because I think the model right now is too simple. It's just a proof of concept. The workspace itself, the modules that we're connecting to it, the attention system, everything is way too trivial. But I think the question could become a bit more pressing in a couple of iterations when we have many more modules, maybe an embodied agent, and so on. And so I think it's important to consider this question right now, before it's too late, let's say. But before addressing this question, I would also like to turn the question to other models that are more standard nowadays in AI, I would like to take the point of view of LLMs, large language models, and ask I would like to ask whether these systems are conscious or not, but it's not something I can do directly because we don't have a good test of consciousness, as I've just explained. But what I can do is ask how these language models understand the symbols that they manipulate, how they give meaning to these symbols. And so for current systems, the answer is very clear. The meaning or the understanding of these systems is based on what we call distributional semantics. It's a term that comes from linguistics. So basically, when an LLM is producing the word, or we call it the token for chocolate, it's doing this because it has learned in a very large training data set, it has learned the distribution of occurrence and co-occurrences of this particular word with other words or tokens. And so everything it knows is entirely based on this distribution. And in contrast, if we ask how humans understand the symbols that they manipulate, when a human produces the word chocolate, of course, they have access to these distributional semantics because we've read text about chocolate and we've seen the relation with other words in the text. But in addition, we would also derive the meaning from associations with other modalities. We can see the chocolate, we can touch it, we can smell it, we can remember that our grandma used to make delicious hot chocolate and so on. And collectively, this is called referential meaning. It's also what I've called grounding in some of the previous slides. And this grounding is clearly present in our global workspace models by construction, but it's clearly lacking in current language models. I just want to make a point that you might argue, well, the problem is a little more complex nowadays because recently LLMs have been augmented with new modalities like vision and action. So now we have multimodal versions of these LLMs. So maybe they have something like grounding or something like referential semantics. And to answer this, we actually need to look under the hood at how these systems are trained. And so far, the answer is always the same. When people train these LLMs today, they're always starting from a pre-trained, pre-existing LLM, so a standard language model that has learned the distribution of tokens. And then when they add a new modality like action or vision, then people would just train what they call an adapter network that would just create new tokens for this new modality, but it's really as if you're trying to find words that can describe the images from the point of view of the language model. And I think we can all agree that this is not really grounding because you cannot build grounding on top of a pre-existing language model because then it's all distributional meaning all over again. What you need to do is build language on top of grounding so that there is true referential meaning inside the system. And so to finish, I want to tell you why, in the context of consciousness, why I believe this grounding, this referential meaning is so important. Because to me, I think this grounding is actually possibly the major component of phenomenal consciousness. If you remember this image that I showed at the beginning, as soon as the tiger enters the global workspace and it broadcasts its information to all of the other modules, I told you that as a consequence of this broadcasting, we get these properties of grounding or affordance. We can also describe this representation as a unified representation. There is increased richness of content because instead of being a purely visual representation, it now becomes a multimodal representation. It captures sensory motor contingencies. It can be described as a multimodal survey of the agent's world. And the reason I'm using all these terms here is that these terms have been used by various authors to characterize phenomenal consciousness in different theories of consciousness. And to summarize, our global workspace has these properties, or could have these properties by construction, but LLMs and even the multimodal version of LLMs don't have these properties. And that's why I think today they're very unlikely to be conscious, but the question remains open for our global workspace models, and I will keep working on this question. So I want to stop here. Sorry for going a bit over time. I'm happy to take any questions if there are.